Hello there everybody and welcome to the video. So Paradox have outlined their roadmap plan for Imperator Rome, and it's getting its first major update at the end of this month. So I thought we'd go through the roadmap and discuss the patch a bit. The roadmap is as follows. On June 26th we have the 1.1 Pompey update. It focuses on navies, pirates, and expanding internal politics and management. We'll talk about this more in detail later. In September, the 1.2 Cicero update is planned, which intends on overhauling monarch power resources. It seemingly removes them and introduces a new resource called political influence. This will, quote, create a unique dynamic way to engage with your government, unquote. In Q4 of 2019, so likely to be a November or early December update, the 1.3 Livy update will release alongside the first DLC content pack. This update will aim to create distinct national identities and regional narratives. And in Q2 of 2020, so that's at the earliest going to be April, the 1.4 Cassander update will drop with the first game expansion, but no news or info on what any of that's going to do. So that's the roadmap. Currently, Imperator Rome is still listed as mostly negative on Steam, and reviews are trending down every day. The player base is at under 1,000 players typically, which I'm sure is in part indicative of announcing a roadmap and people waiting for the patch, and partly people moving on. The game was also announced to be bundled into the Microsoft Xbox Game Pass on PC at E3, so right now, for 1 month, you can play it for $1, as well as a bunch of other games. Now bear in mind, the subscription service will then increase to $15 after June. So that's the current state of the game. First, I'm going to go through a bit more in detail what's coming in this first patch on June 26th. Then, I'm going to go over the roadmap and just discuss some thoughts I have about how they're approaching Imperator Rome post-launch. So before we get into the upcoming patch, I don't want to do too much of a deep dive on it because I'll be covering it when it does come out in a couple weeks anyway, but I'll list off what I think are some of the most notable features. Number 1, Naval Improvements. Now this is a long one, but there is good stuff in here. There are now 6 types of ships, split across 3 classes, light, medium, and heavy. The different ships in the different classes essentially have different damage values and maneuverability versus their costs. Interestingly, light ships don't require wood, so now all countries with ports will be able to construct navies if they wish. Medium ships still require wood, and heavy ships require military traditions to unlock. There's no mention if heavy ships require wood, but if they don't, that does seem like a bit of an oversight. I personally would have them require wood and iron as a combination in the same province to make resource swapping a bit more meaningful. Now during combat, navies now have their own tactics, much like land combat, and then they also have the chance of capturing enemy ships if the enemy's morale has broken but their ship strength has not. So if you were to jump on a low morale navy, chances are you're going to be capturing some of their ships. Sounds good. Navies now have 3 new abilities. They can capture port. This one is really cool. If you have 5 heavy ships in your navy, you can capture an undefended port city to establish a beachhead before landing troops. I really like that one. Port raid is the next one. If a port has a fort on it and it's currently under siege, a port raid will instantly create a breach. It requires you to have at least 1 heavy ship, and it will take damage when it does that raid. Port Assault is the last one. This can reduce the fort level of a city by 1. It has to be at least 1 already, I believe, but requires your fleet to have a Mega Polyreme at full strength. This is the most expensive heavy ship in the game. Navies now also have a naval range. This is a limit on how far ships can go before they begin taking attrition. It's a pretty large amount of space, but generally speaking, I'm just not a fan of this. The naval range is based on your country, not based on where the navy sets out from. So I see this as a very frustrating mechanic. In the screenshot, we can see he's playing as Carthage. If you set out from Sicily to Greece, you'll take the same attrition as you would from Sicily to northern Iberia. That's not good. It doesn't really make any sense. It's just like an artificial limit. Now personally, I think ships should have some sort of supply system that they can replenish in ports, then they can venture out as far as they want as long as their supply lasts. Maybe being on a coastal tile reduces your consumption of supplies, and then when you're low, you'll start taking more attrition more and more heavily as you run out before needing to go back to a port again. You could have maybe an alert banner, to let you know, hey, low supply on your ship, or display it in red in the outline if you don't want, to be that invasive. Along with these changes, there's also now navigable rivers and naval terrain. So open sea, coastal sea, and river terrains are distinguished from each other. On rivers, for instance, light ships excel, while coastal battles always give the defender the advantage. So there's some interesting dynamics and more meaningful things going on with it when it comes to navies now in Imperator. They basically seem on par with land armies. I do think, again, a supply system would work wonders for it. For instance, supplies could be maxed out at 100 per ship, but if you're transporting an army, they'd get depleted much quicker, so ferrying armies to foreign lands would be much more costly. I would love something like that, just so naval embarkment is a much bigger deal than just a blanket attrition system for if you're at sea. Number 2, pirates. Pirates will now be less of a static coastline threat. Instead, they will operate much more like mercenaries, where they are able to be hired by nearby countries and used in navies. If they're never hired, then pirates will set out on raids, looking for undefended ports to loot. If successful, they will then return to their pirate haven. Now, pirate havens are locations which pirate fleets reside in, and they provide a small buff to the city where they are. If you want to destroy a haven, you need to be at war, move a unit to the city, and clear them out through some sort of unit ability. Interestingly, you can actually enact a law to condone piracy to allow new havens to be created in your cities, or to outlaw piracy, which gives you a CB on all other empires with pirate havens. So you can actually go to war in order to remove pirates from foreign lands. It does seem a little bit strange to declare a full-on war for that. You know, you'd almost think that they'd work together, but if they're condoning it, I guess it makes sense. Number 3, natural disasters. Imperator is getting the addition of thunderstorms, blizzards, sandstorms, and volcanic eruptions. Essentially, it seems that these storms will cause great attrition and last a couple of months on the map. No word yet if they slow you down while going through them, and if you're in a friendly fort, you're actually just protected anyway. As for the eruptions, apparently you can expect new volcanoes on the map and 1 to 2 eruptions per playthrough. Now, from the little GIFs and images we saw, they seem like they'll make the map feel just a bit more alive, so thumbs up for them. Number 4, country unique changes. Paradox are introducing a number of changes to countries in a growing effort to make them more distinct from one another. First off are the heritages. This is a basic 2 buffs, 1 drawback system that never changes. It's just designed to give countries a bit more identity to set them apart. All countries will have a generic heritage, but 20 countries will receive unique ones, and they plan on rolling out more as time goes on. So for instance, Syracusan heritage reduced mercenary upkeep and ship damage received, but citizens are less happy. So I don't know, it feels a bit random to me, but at least it is a bit of a change. There's also now more religious distinction. Now different religions have different omens and effects associated with them. So again, it just creates a little bit more of a distinct playthrough between the countries. You can now convert your religion as well based on a series of conditions. Most notably, your capital must follow the religion in question predominantly, and your high priest must be of that religion, as well as other requirements as well. Some government types are receiving an overhaul. Tribes and monarchies are now getting a sort of war council, while aristocratic republics are getting a dual ruler mechanic. Now a country like Rome will have 2 consuls that affect one another. This would take a lot of explanation, and at the rate things are changing, nothing is really set in stone, so I don't want to go that deeply into it. However, essentially you have the consul and a co-consul. You basically have to keep the co-consul loyal to avoid increased power costs. Then the 2 share certain things, like their popularity is an average between both of them, and their corruption is actually added together. On its own, it doesn't seem that overly interesting as they're both not truly equal. It is a consul and a co-consul, but what will make it interesting are the additional changes coming to characters that will make managing those 2 rulers a new challenge, and it's certainly better than just having the one. Number 5, character changes. So characters will now have something called a power base. This is a number that comes from their loyal troops, their titles, holdings, wealth, and then specifics like how many of the population they govern or their ruler popularity. Power base determines how big of an army that they could raise if a civil war were to kick off. So if you've got a low loyalty character and he's got a big power base, you're going to be in trouble. Holdings have had a bit of a change. Now a character can actually be granted a holding manually, and this will provide them income. A city can only have a holding if it's got 10 slaves in it, and you can have multiple holdings in a city for every 10 slaves. If you've granted a holding, you can no longer move those slaves as well, so they kind of get locked down. Now granting a holding gives an instant benefit to loyalty, but of course more holdings means more power and wealth for that character. If they've got more wealth, it means they can buy their own holdings, thus giving them even more wealth. And typically, the more wealthy and powerful a character is, the less loyal they usually become, though we haven't actually seen if that's a direct kind of correlation in the developer diary as of yet, but that's how it plays at the moment. But this still is sounding really good. I mean, it's interesting, right? There's no power costs, abstractions, or anything like that going on. It's just practical. If a guy owns something, he accumulates wealth, he can own more things, and then he becomes a bit of a problem. That's really, really good, and I'm enjoying the sound of that. We'll have to see how it plays. Bribes are now going to cost gold, for instance, which is good. You can bring characters to trial now if they've got low loyalty. You can send them out adventuring if you want to make them a mercenary and let them get some experience, and they return over time if they live. They can be the target of another character's plan, or they could actually plan the assassination of other characters as well. They now have something called schemes. These are like ambitions, where a personal character objective that has a goal and a duration. The player can assist or interfere in these schemes, and they're different depending on the traits, position, and a number of other factors. Rulers will also have a much bigger, more impactful scheme. The example we saw was siphoning funds out of the treasury for themselves. There's also assassinate and prove legitimacy. These all sound very, very interesting. Ultimately, this stuff is apparently a first step towards a deeper character system, but I think already it's looking very promising from what little we have seen. And that's it for the 5 major features coming to Imperator's Pompey patch. Some are pretty good, some are just okay, and some not really that high priority in my opinion. And as I've mentioned, I'm not covering everything here. There's a bunch of little minor tweaks, or maybe not so minor depending on your viewpoint, but things to trade and modifiers and a bunch of little buffs and things like that. However, because these are such radical changes and they're shifting in between the dev diaries as they scramble to figure out what the community really wants from this game, I just don't feel like it's really worth delving into, because it's just not set in stone. Nothing is anymore, it seems. Which brings me back to the roadmap. There's been several diaries and podcasts from Paradox now where they have gone over the feedback that they've received from the community since Imperator Rome launched. From what I've gathered, they mostly seem to be leaning towards that because EU4 is so deep and CK2 with all their DLCs and updates, that the expectations were a little bit too high for this game. That seems to be partially the case. I mean, there's definitely people out there that can't help but compare the 3 games, I guess, which is fair. I mean, they were marketed that way, but I think the reality that is somewhat now setting in is that the game is just far too wide, far too abstract, and far too easy, and just not very deep once you learn the mechanics. So in an effort to improve this, despite all the convincing telling us that mana powers were here to stay, and that they were good game design and so on and so forth, it is being removed. This is an amazingly bold gamble from Paradox. In September, with the 1.2 update, Imperator Rome is going to be a completely different game. The 4 power resources tie everything in the game together. It's no coincidence that characters have 4 attributes, that there's 4 pop types, 4 technology types, or 4 buildings. Changing those 4 core resources is a huge fundamental change, and if they replace it with something that doesn't work, they're going to be left with a very, very butchered game design. So I'm really nervous for them. This patch is all well and good, and it's definitely trending in the right direction, but I'm so nervous for how they're going to make their new resource, which is called political influence, really tie things together. I think it's a very bold step, as I said, and I do think it is a necessary one, but replacing 4 resources with 1 requires a huge rethink of almost all other areas of the game. If you're only relying on money and manpower as your practical resources, then you need far more interaction with pops and buildings to simulate a kind of an empire building to give an effect to those resources. Maybe introducing a food resource or having more practical applications for the trade items that you can trade with other empires. You have all these interesting trade goods, but everything just amounts to getting a small buff. You know, I'd love it if grain, fish, and livestock increased a food stockpile, or if having a combination of resources allowed for unique things and special buildings. Let's say you have dyes and cloth in the same province, well then maybe you could build a building for textiles, and it could produce stronger income buffs or something. Or you could go further with it and say if you have furs, leather, base metals, maybe then you can build outfitters, which lets you make armies faster or gain some experience already or something like that. Just something to have a payoff to resources instead of a flat, instant trade value across them all and flat bonuses as soon as you get them instantly. It's just boring in my opinion, I guess. There's no end to the types of cool buildings you could have. You know, marble, glass, and papyrus, mix them together, you can build, I don't know, an institution, gain benefits from technology, then tie it to characters by having characters with holdings in that province. Maybe their family has a chance of developing better skills because they're educated, you know, tie it all together. is kind of what I feel like they need to do, because at the moment things are segmented into just these separate buffs, and currently they're being held together a little bit by the Monarch power. So I'm just very, very eager to see what's going to happen when they remove that. The stuff that I've mentioned is so close and achievable in the game, I feel, and it'd be a totally unique system, different to any other Paradox game, offering something that none of their other games really do, in my opinion. Tying the resources together, using them, working through diplomacy to get resources, and then building up your empire because of them. Anyways, that's really it for this video. I'm going into a little bit of rant territory, I suppose. It's not my game. I like to offer design ideas, but at the end of the day, it's up to them. But let me know what you think. Is this enough to make you come back for the 1.1 patch, or are you going to wait until September to see what replaces the mana system and how that plays? For me, I think this patch looks good, and I think good on them for outlining a whole year of roadmap, but I find myself not terribly interested in playing the game when I know the foundation is really going to change big time in 3 months. I'm still curious to try this patch out though, and will be reporting on it when I do. Now before I go, I want to remind you that if you want to get more involved with Republic of Play, we have a Discord for chatting and organizing multiplayer games across multiple games, Imperator Rome, Total War, Stellaris. If you want to help support the channel, Patreon is a great way to help keep the lights on and get yourself a priority for those multiplayer games. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook, all the links and stuff are in the description. If you never want to miss a video, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.